So, you've decided to click on a video about a white-haired elf who spends 80% of her screen time looking for legendary grimoires that do absolutely nothing except maybe flip a pancake or remove a stubborn stain. Congratulations, you have excellent taste. Or you're just as bored as Frieren waiting for a century-old flower to bloom. Today, we're diving into the absolute mess that is the elven brain, specifically focusing on why Frieren is basically the poster child for temporal perception disorder, which is a fancy way of saying her internal clock isn't just broken, it's operating on a completely different dimension, where a decade is basically a long weekend. Imagine waking up, realizing you forgot to buy milk, and then deciding to wait 50 years for the local grocery store to have a sale because, hey, what's a few decades among friends? That is the vibe we are dealing with here. In psychology, subjective time perception refers to the way our minds experience the passage of time differently depending on our age, environment, and, apparently, whether or not we have pointy ears. For us, mere mortals, a summer spent with friends feels like an eternity when we're 10, but for Frieren, the 10-year journey to defeat the Demon King was essentially a brisk walk to the mailbox. She treats the literal peak of her life, the most heroic era of human history, as a footnote in her planner. The problem starts with the time compression effect, a phenomenon where the more experiences you accumulate, the shorter each new unit of time feels. Think about it. When you're 5, 1 year is 20% of your entire existence. It's huge. When you're Frieren and you've been wandering the woods for a millennium, 10 years is like 1% of your life. It's a rounding error. This is why she looks at Himmel the hero, a man who dedicated his entire life to being the main character, and basically says, "Oh, you're dying already? I just finished putting my shoes on." It's not that she's heartless, it's just that her brain is suffering from a massive case of temporal discounting. In the world of behavioral economics and psychology, this is the tendency to devalue rewards that happen far in the future. But in Frieren's case, it works backward. She devalues the present because she assumes there's always a later. To her, saying goodbye to someone for 50 years is the equivalent of telling a coworker you'll see them after the holiday break. She doesn't realize that for humans, the holiday break is actually the entire duration of our retirement and subsequent death. It's honestly hilarious and tragic how she navigates the world with this massive cognitive bias. Specifically, she's stuck in a loop of procrastination driven by the illusion of infinite time. You see her wandering around collecting useless spells like the spell to turn sweet grapes sour, and you think, girl, your friends are literally turning to dust as we speak. But in her head, she's operating under the planning fallacy, which is our innate tendency to underestimate how long a task will take. Only for Frieren, the task is understanding human emotions, and her estimate for completion is, I'll get to it in a century or two. She doesn't feel the urgency because she lacks the biological triggers for future-oriented anxiety. Most of us are sweating because we're turning 30 and haven't started a 401k. Frieren is 1,000 years old and hasn't even figured out why the handsome hero was blushing every time she looked at him. Then we have the funeral. Oh, the funeral. This is where the delayed emotional response kicks in. Because her perception of time is so stretched out, her brain doesn't process the finality of death in real time. It's like she's on a high-latency server with a ping of 50 years. She stands at Himmel's grave and finally has a breakdown. Not because she just lost him, but because the reminiscence bump finally hit her. In psychology, this bump is the tendency for older adults to have increased recollection for events that occurred during their adolescence and early adulthood. For Frieren, those 10 years with the party were her adolescence in terms of social development. She spent a millennium being a hermit, but those 10 years were so packed with emotional stimuli that they outweigh the previous 900 years of staring at moss.
なんでもっと知ろうと思わなかったんだろう。
When she cries at the funeral, she's experiencing a sudden, violent shift from semantic memory, which is just knowing facts like Himmel was a guy I traveled with, to episodic memory, which is the vivid, emotional re-experiencing of specific moments. She suddenly realizes that while 10 years was a blank for her, it was the definitive chapter of Himmel's life. She's essentially a victim of chronostasis, that weird illusion where the first tick of a clock seems to last longer than the others when you first look at it. Her look at humanity lasted 10 years, and suddenly the clock started ticking again, but only after the person she was looking at was gone. The sarcasm really writes itself when you watch her take on Fern as an apprentice. She treats Fern like a particularly slow-growing potted plant. She's shocked that Fern grows up and starts having opinions, because in Frieren's world, children should stay children for at least a few decades. This is a classic case of egocentric bias, where she assumes everyone else experiences the flow of time exactly the same way she does. She is genuinely baffled that Fern is annoyed after waiting 3 months in a single village for a flower to bloom. To Frieren, 3 months is a nap. To Fern, that's a significant percentage of her youth spent watching her master look at dirt. It's almost like Frieren has a permanent case of duration neglect, where the length of an experience doesn't actually matter to her as much as the end of it. Psychology tells us we judge experiences based on their peak and their end, the peak-end rule. Frieren, however, lived through the peak with the hero party, but because she's functionally immortal, she never expected the end. When the end finally came, it shattered her worldview, forcing her to reevaluate every second of those 10 years. Now, her entire journey is an attempt to fix her retrospective memory. She's retracing her steps because she realized she was absent even while she was physically there. She's trying to convert those fast-forwarded memories into something meaningful, effectively trying to cure her own anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure from standard experiences, by finally paying attention to the short lives of those around her. And let's talk about the demons for a second, because they take this temporal distortion and turn it into a weapon. To a demon in this show, language isn't for communication, it's a tool for gaslighting and manipulation evolved over centuries. Their perception of time is just as warped as Frieren's, but they use it for predatory efficiency. Frieren's disorder makes her lonely, but the demon's disorder makes them monsters. They don't have effective empathy, the ability to feel what others feel, because why bother feeling for something that lives and dies in the span of a demon's lunch break? Frieren is stuck in the middle. She has the lifespan of a monster, but the growing heart of a human, and that creates a massive cognitive dissonance. She hates demons because they're a reflection of what she could have been, a being who treats human lives as fleeting, meaningless sparks. So the next time you're procrastinating on a project and think, I've got time, just remember Frieren. You don't have elven time. You have Himmel is going to be old and bald before you finish this time. Frieren's journey is essentially one long therapy session for someone suffering from existential inertia. She's learning that even if time is relative, the impact of a single moment is absolute. She's moving from a state of passive observation to active engagement, even if she still does it with the facial expression of someone who's trying to remember if they left the stove on in the year 1400. Ultimately, Frieren, beyond Journey's End, I don't understand why they decided to give it that name for the English-speaking world. In my opinion, the name Frieren the Assassin has much more impact, especially for a certain scene in Chapter 9, and it also creates an interesting dissonance with the fact that most of the time they're just traveling, is a beautiful, sarcastic, and heartbreaking look at how we measure our lives. It's a reminder that we're all suffering from a bit of time perception issues. We think we have forever until we don't. We skip the small moments because we're looking for the big Demon King milestones, only to realize later that the milestones were actually just the quiet campfire chats along the way. Frieren is finally learning to use her broken clock to appreciate the seconds, even if she still needs a human to wake her up at noon every day, because at the end of the day, no matter how much longevity you have, you can't buy back a single missed thank you or a goodbye said too late. I hope you enjoyed the first video on this channel. I'll be uploading videos twice a week, so see you in a few days.